Some mistakes are loud. Others are quiet, dressed as everyday moments, like a cold meal served to the wrong man, at the wrong time. This is the story of Vincent Silver, a powerful millionaire used to having the world bend to his will, until one ordinary dinner forced him to confront something extraordinary. He thought he was correcting a careless waitress. He didn't realize he was standing in the presence of someone who would teach him the greatest lesson of his life, without raising her voice. What began as frustration turned into reflection. And what started as a complaint became the beginning of change. But before we dive in, where are you watching this from tonight? Tell us in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. Vincent Silver had built an empire on precision, a man of few words and many results. His reputation preceded him, the kind of presence that silenced a room before he even stepped into it. At 47, he was the CEO of one of the most respected software firms in Europe. His name opened doors, closed deals, and left people standing a little straighter when he entered a room. But none of that mattered tonight. Because tonight, Vincent was tired. Not the kind of tired that a night's sleep could fix. This was the exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. 5 days of high-stakes meetings, boardroom politics, and faces that only smiled when they needed something. He was used to pressure, thrived in it even, but lately, something had begun to shift. The weight of control, once exhilarating, now felt suffocating. His luxury penthouse offered no comfort. It was a space designed to impress, not to breathe. Everything was perfectly arranged, cold stone counters, glass walls with city views, sleek furniture no one ever sat on. It was a place that said, "You've made it," but whispered nothing of rest. That night, as the car rolled to a stop outside his building, Vincent didn't get out. He told his driver to keep going, anywhere quiet, anywhere unfamiliar. 10 minutes later, they turned onto a narrow, cobblestone street that seemed to belong to another time. Raindrops from earlier in the evening still clung to the stones, reflecting the soft glow of string lights that framed a small restaurant on the corner. It wasn't listed among the city's elite spots. No Michelin stars. No trending hashtags. Just a warm light and the hum of soft music leaking out the windows. Vincent stepped out. There were no hostesses rushing to greet him, no velvet ropes to part. For the first time in years, he walked into a place where no one knew his name, and no one cared. The air smelled of fresh herbs and warm bread. The lighting was gentle, the chatter quiet but sincere. Couples leaned toward each other in candlelight. A lone man read from a leather-bound book. A group of friends shared dessert with the ease of familiarity. It all felt human. He sat at a small table by the window and gave a subtle nod to the waiter. No menu, no fuss. Just the house special. He wanted to be invisible, to disappear into the rhythm of a place that expected nothing from him. But then the food arrived. And it was cold. Not lukewarm. Cold. The kind of cold that says this plate has been sitting out far too long. Vincent stared at it, the silence around him suddenly too loud. It wasn't about the meal, not really. It was about what it symbolized. The flaw, the misstep. A crack in the order of his carefully curated world. Something inside him snapped. He rose from his seat, slow but sharp, the air shifting as he moved. His eyes scanned the room, locking onto a woman emerging from the kitchen. She wore a dark apron and carried herself with calm purpose, balancing plates while offering soft nods to the tables she passed. To Vincent, she looked like staff. An employee. Someone responsible for the mistake. The words came fast, loaded with the kind of frustration that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the week he'd had. It wasn't anger, it was armor. The voice of a man who demanded excellence and punished errors. A tone sharpened by power, blunted by fatigue. But what Vincent didn't know, not yet, was that this woman was not who he thought she was. She wasn't a waitress. She wasn't staff. She was the owner. And she wasn't just running the restaurant, she was the soul of it. In the seconds that followed his outburst, the room fell silent. Utensils paused midair. Conversations halted. The woman didn't flinch. She simply stood there, looking at him, not with fear or submission, but with something deeper. Something steady. The kind of gaze that makes a man question his reflection. A waiter quietly stepped forward and leaned in, whispering something to Vincent. And everything changed. The woman he'd just scolded, humiliated in front of a dozen strangers, was the person who built this place from the ground up. A former chef, a quiet leader. The kind of person who didn't just manage, she served when her team needed her. Tonight, she had stepped into the floor to help her understaffed crew after one of the cooks had to leave sick. And because of that, because she led by doing, she became a target of a man too used to being right. Vincent stood frozen. The silence around him no longer felt like power, it felt like shame. He had made a mistake. But not just a social one. A human one. He had seen someone and assumed her role. Projected his exhaustion onto a stranger. Reacted with pride instead of curiosity. And in doing so, he missed the most important detail of all. This wasn't about the food. This was about who we become when no one is watching. And for the first time in a long time, Vincent Silver realized he didn't like who he'd just been. The moment the words left his mouth, the air in the restaurant changed. There was no crash, no raised voices in return, only silence. A silence thick enough to press against the walls, to steal the warmth from the flickering candles. Every eye turned. Every movement stopped. And yet, Vincent didn't notice at first. He was too far inside his own frustration, too buried in the rhythms of a life where being wrong was unthinkable. He had spoken loudly, not to humiliate, but to assert control. It was instinct, something wired into him after years of commanding rooms, running teams, outmaneuvering competitors. Control had been his compass for decades. But here, in this unassuming little restaurant, control had just slipped through his fingers. The woman in the apron stood still, plate still in her hands, her eyes meeting his with quiet resolve. She didn't defend herself. Didn't argue. She simply let the moment stretch, long enough for Vincent to feel the gravity of it. And then came the whisper. A waiter, young and soft-spoken, stepped beside him and leaned in. His words weren't meant for the room, just for Vincent. A single sentence that rewrote everything. That's the owner. At first, Vincent didn't understand. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The owner? But she was wearing an apron. She had come from the kitchen. She was carrying plates. Yes, because she was helping. Because someone in her staff had fallen ill. Because she believed in stepping in, not stepping above. Because leadership, for her, meant service. Suddenly, the weight of what he'd done came crashing down. Vincent's heart didn't race. It slowed. The adrenaline faded, leaving something heavier behind. Shame wasn't a feeling he was familiar with, not really. In the world he came from, mistakes were fixed with bonuses, lawsuits, or silence. You didn't apologize. You repositioned. You reframed. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was real life. And he had just exposed a version of himself he wished didn't exist. She continued walking, calm and dignified, placing the dish on another table as if nothing had happened. But something had. Something irreversible. He watched as she moved through the restaurant, not with urgency, but with care. Checking in on tables, refilling a water glass, laughing quietly with an older couple by the window. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't performative. She was solid. It wasn't just the mistake that stung, it was the way she handled it. With grace. With maturity. With a confidence that didn't need to be loud to be heard. Vincent sat back down, slowly, almost mechanically. The cold food in front of him remained untouched. He felt exposed. And worse, he felt small. Not because she made him feel that way, but because she hadn't. She hadn't retaliated. Hadn't corrected him publicly. Hadn't weaponized her authority. She had simply allowed him to see himself. And in that reflection, he didn't recognize the man staring back. He tried to focus on the room again. To reclaim the sense of detachment he had when he first walked in. But it was gone. Now, every detail felt sharpened. The warmth of the lighting, the clinking of forks against porcelain, the occasional burst of laughter. These people weren't just having dinner. They were experiencing something he hadn't in years, presence. And there she was again, moving gracefully between tables, checking on guests with a hand on their shoulder or a smile that reached her eyes. She wasn't managing, she was caring. And people responded not out of obligation, but out of respect. She had built something here, something real. And in one careless moment, he had tried to shatter it with his ego. He watched her disappear briefly through a swinging door, then return without the apron. Her hair was loosely tied back, her sleeves rolled. She carried herself differently now, lighter, more fluid. As if the confrontation had left no residue on her. As if she had already let it go. Vincent, however, couldn't. He looked down at the cold plate again, but not with resentment. Now it looked like a symbol. Not of failure, but of fragility. How easy it had been to assume, to accuse, to forget that every space, even the smallest restaurant on the quietest street, had a story, and people with names and reasons and lives just as complex as his. The woman stopped by another table. The guests rose to hug her. She laughed, nodded, and whispered something that made them smile. It was clear she knew her customers. Not as transactions, but as people. Vincent tried to imagine her sitting behind a CEO desk, barking orders, wearing a power suit, and couldn't. She didn't need a corner office. Her authority came from a deeper place. One he hadn't learned to access. And that realization cut deeper than anything. For the first time in a long time, Vincent didn't want to be the richest man in the room. He wanted to be the kindest. He didn't know how to fix what he'd done. He didn't even know how to begin. But something had shifted. The world that once felt like a system to be mastered was now something else entirely. It was a place to be humbled. And tonight, Vincent Silver was about to learn that humility, once felt deeply enough, doesn't break a man. It rebuilds him. The night unfolded like a lesson Vincent had never asked for, but one he desperately needed. He stayed seated, hands resting on the edge of the table, watching the restaurant continue its rhythm without him. Nobody whispered behind menus. Nobody pointed. It wasn't that people hadn't noticed the outburst, they had. But the place itself, the people within it, operated on a different current. Forgiveness wasn't spoken, it was practiced. Dignity wasn't demanded, it was offered freely. And the woman who had every right to confront him? She had simply chosen not to. Vincent remained still, letting the sounds of clinking cutlery, soft music, and laughter do what they hadn't done in years, remind him that life existed outside his orbit. He could feel the gravity of his own insignificance, and somehow, it didn't crush him. It clarified him. He wanted to know her name. Not because she had impressed him, though she had. But because he realized how rarely he saw people anymore. Really saw them. Her presence unsettled something deep in him, not just because of who she was, but because of who he had been in front of her. The waiter returned to clear the plate, saying nothing about its untouched state. Vincent considered asking questions, but words still felt like the wrong currency. He didn't want information. He wanted understanding. So he stayed. He watched. Over the next 30 minutes, he witnessed something rare, a kind of leadership no boardroom could teach. She wasn't just managing operations. She was building community. She poured wine, adjusted lighting, wiped a spill unnoticed by others. When the dessert station grew busy, she stepped behind the counter and plated 3 dishes herself, moving with grace and confidence. Vincent was used to executives who delegated down, who never got their hands dirty, who wore title-like armor. But here was someone who led by showing up, even when it wasn't her job, even when no one was watching. And when she finally sat down for a moment at a quiet corner table, he saw it, the brief crack in her composure. She exhaled, closed her eyes, rubbed her temples. It lasted no more than 5 seconds. But in those seconds, she stopped being the symbol of his guilt and became something more intimate. A real person, tired, trying, enduring. That tiny moment broke something open in him. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror. He just never expected to see it on someone so composed. Vincent stood and walked toward the back of the restaurant. Not to leave, but to think. There was a hallway near the restrooms, quiet and dimly lit. He leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of himself. The man who had come in tonight had been sharp, focused, armored. The man standing there now felt stripped down. Not weak, just unprotected. his wealth, his power, his name. None of it had protected him from this moment of clarity. And then he heard it, soft voices coming from the staff kitchen just beyond a cracked door. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the voice was hers. She was checking in on her team, asking about the cook who'd gone home sick, asking if anyone needed to leave early, if the dishwasher was working, if someone had eaten dinner yet. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't even tired in her tone. Just steady. Just kind. That was when it hit him. His cold plate hadn't been carelessness. It had been consequence. Someone was sick. Someone had to leave. And she had stepped in. She had filled the gap. She had done the very thing he never did anymore. She'd absorbed someone else's burden. And he had met that act of service with contempt. That shame returned, not as a sharp sting, but as something duller, heavier. A slow ache behind the ribs. He walked back to his table and sat down. The music played on. The candles still flickered. But the world felt different. He didn't finish his meal. He asked for tea instead, quietly, gently. The woman returned briefly to the floor, no apron now, just herself. Her steps carried no resentment. If she felt anything toward him, it wasn't visible. And that, somehow, hurt more than outrage ever could. She had let go. She had moved on. And Vincent was still sitting there, stuck in the orbit of a single moment he couldn't undo. She wasn't trying to teach him anything. But she had. And that was the power of it. He left a generous tip. Not out of guilt, but out of respect. Not to compensate, but to acknowledge. And before he exited the restaurant, he turned one last time, hoping to catch her eye, just once. But she was behind the bar, drying glasses, already focused on something else. That would be the beginning. Of what he didn't know yet. But a plate served cold had just awakened something that years of luxury had kept frozen. Vincent Silver had come looking for a quiet dinner. Instead, he found the first mirror he hadn't broken. And somewhere in the quiet hum of that little restaurant, he realized the warmest thing served that night wasn't food. Vincent didn't sleep that night. He tried. He followed his usual routine: chamomile tea, blackout curtains, the low hum of white noise in the background. But the silence no longer felt soothing. It felt loud. Every time he closed his eyes, her face returned, not as a confrontation, but as a presence. Calm, unshaken, human. The next morning, he opened his laptop to review a pitch deck for a potential merger, but the numbers danced without meaning. The words blurred. His focus, once laser-sharp, was fractured. Something inside him had shifted. Not violently, not even suddenly, but enough to throw the weight off balance. He had spent decades mastering structure, building systems, closing deals, negotiating outcomes. But no spreadsheet could quantify what he'd felt in that restaurant. No algorithm could process humility. And no asset portfolio could teach him how to sit with the discomfort of having been wrong in front of someone who never even raised her voice. He needed to know more. Not because he wanted to repair his image. No one in that restaurant had filmed the moment. There was no scandal. No headlines. This wasn't about damage control. It was about understanding the person behind the grace. So he returned. 3 days later, at the same hour, he stepped inside the same door. No suit. No watch. Just jeans, a soft shirt, and hands that fidgeted in his pockets. She wasn't there. A waiter recognized him, surprised but not tense. There was no trace of the awkwardness he expected. He was seated at the same table. This time, he asked for the owner's name. Camille. Camille. A name simple and strong, like her presence. It anchored something in him. He waited, ordered slowly, ate deliberately. And just before dessert, she emerged from the back, a clipboard in hand, checking deliveries with one of the chefs. She looked up once and saw him. Her expression didn't change. No smile. No bitterness. Just quiet acknowledgement. He stood when she walked by. There were no words exchanged. She simply placed a small folded napkin on his table before walking away. Inside was a handwritten note. "You don't need to say anything. I saw you." That was it. But it unraveled him. He didn't expect forgiveness, not like this. Not with so few words. But what pierced him most wasn't the gentleness of it. It was the certainty. She had already moved past it. Not because it didn't matter, but because she didn't carry what wasn't hers to hold. Vincent walked home that night under a sky smeared with early stars, the note still in his jacket pocket. And somewhere between two city blocks, it dawned on him. He had spent years building a version of himself that didn't know how to receive kindness without suspicion, without transaction, without control. Camille had shown him something he didn't know how to name. He started researching her. Not obsessively, curiously. Her restaurant had opened 5 years earlier. No investors. No press tour. Just savings, sweat, and soul. Reviews mentioned the warmth of the space. The way the staff seemed genuinely happy. The consistency of service, even on the busiest nights. One article quoted her. "We serve foods, but we also serve pause. People come here to remember what it feels like to breathe slowly." Vincent reread the line 3 times. He couldn't remember the last time he'd breathed slowly. A week passed. Then 2. On the 3rd week, he returned again. This time, she sat with him. Not long. Just 10 minutes. She asked nothing about his business, his wealth, his influence. She spoke of the garden behind the kitchen, where she grew her own herbs. Of a dishwasher who had just been accepted into culinary school. Of the sick cook, who was recovering well. She said none of it to impress him. She simply shared her world. And in doing so, she revealed the part of life he had spent decades neglecting, the quiet part. The part where value isn't measured, but felt. Camille didn't offer redemption. She offered reflection. Vincent began to return regularly. Not always to eat. Sometimes just to sit. To observe. To listen. To understand the weight of gentleness. He watched how she handled chaos. A broken espresso machine, a last-minute cancellation, a delivery gone wrong, with the same steady tone. Not passive. Just rooted. And it wasn't just her. It was the culture she had built. A place where mistakes weren't met with panic, but with patience. Where problems weren't fires to extinguish, but opportunities to adapt. He realized how differently he had led. His companies ran like machines, efficient, ruthless, unfeeling. He had equated speed with success, obedience with loyalty, performance with worth. Camille didn't lead machines. She led people. And slowly, that truth began to haunt him. What had he missed in all those boardrooms? What softness had he crushed in the name of results? How many times had someone brought him a cold plate, metaphorically, and been dismissed without context? And how many times had he failed to ask, why? This wasn't just about one dinner. It was about a lifetime of never looking beneath the surface. And now, with Camille's quiet presence echoing in his life, Vincent Silver began to realize. The true temperature of a man's character isn't measured in the heat of his victories. It's revealed in how he reacts to something as simple as a cold plate. Some apologies are loud, rehearsed, dramatic, crafted to be seen. Others are quiet, almost invisible, delivered not through words but through action. Vincent Silver, a man once fluent only in power and persuasion, was learning how to speak the second kind. He waited, not for the right moment, but for the right presence. Camille wasn't someone you interrupted. She wasn't impressed by urgency, nor moved by performance. She existed in stillness, in careful observation. So he let time pass. Days became weeks. Seasons edged forward. And in the quiet intervals between their meetings, something inside him began to settle. The old Vincent, the one who measured everything by efficiency and leverage, would have tried to fix the moment like a problem. A gift. A donation. A renovation of the restaurant, perhaps. A gesture grand enough to wipe the slate clean. But Camille didn't need fixing. And the slate wasn't hers to clear. This wasn't about a mistake. It was about humility. He began with the smallest thing he could offer, consistency. He returned once a week. Not always to eat. Sometimes just to sit at the corner table with a book, a tea, and silence. Other times he stayed late, long after the rush, helping the staff stack chairs or collect candles. No one asked him to. No one expected it. But he found comfort in those small, unnoticed tasks. One evening, when a dishwasher called in sick, he stepped in, not because he was qualified, but because he could. No apron. No spotlight. Just a man with sleeves rolled, quietly scrubbing dishes in the back of a kitchen that no longer felt foreign. Camille never praised him. Never questioned him. She simply allowed him to exist there. No titles, no shields. And that, more than anything, began to unravel his defenses. The apology, when it came, wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted. It didn't happen across a table or with violins in the background. It happened on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, when the restaurant was closed and Camille was tending to the herb garden behind the building. Vincent had brought her a book. Not a gift, a loan. A worn, annotated copy of a collection of essays on leadership and humanity. Inside the front cover, he had written one line. "I've spent years learning how to be effective. You reminded me what it means to be good." He didn't stay long. Just long enough to leave the book on the garden bench, and to nod at her as she looked up from the rosemary bush, sleeves muddy and face open to the drizzle. She said nothing, but the pause she gave him before returning to her work, the softness in her gaze, the weight in her silence, that was her reply. And it was enough. From that day on, the dynamic shifted. Not dramatically, not publicly, but subtly. Camille began to greet him with a smile, not warm, not cold, but knowing. The kind of smile that says, "You're learning." He started asking questions. About the suppliers, the staff, the food. Not out of curiosity, but respect. He realized how many hands touched a plate before it reached a table. How many variables could cause a delay, a misstep, a misunderstanding. And how rare it was for anyone to ask why. One evening, when a customer raised their voice over a forgotten side dish, Vincent felt a rush of déjà vu. He watched the staff handle it gently, Camille leading with presence, not power. And he remembered himself. The man he had been. The way his voice had cut through the air that night like a blade. He waited until the customer left, then approached Camille. He didn't bring up the memory. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply offered to help carry a box of linens upstairs. It was a small gesture, but small was beginning to feel like the right size. Weeks later, during a busy Saturday night, Camille handed him a notepad and asked if he could take a wine order. No smile. No explanation. Just quiet trust. It caught him off guard, but he did it. He approached the table, pen shaking slightly in his hand, and listened, really listened, to the guests. Not just their words, but their moods, their energy. He repeated the order back softly, wrote it down, and walked to the bar like it was sacred. When he returned, Camille was watching him from the corner. And for the first time, she nodded. Not as a thank you, but as an equal. That night, Vincent sat in the empty dining room long after the chairs were up and the lights were dimmed. Camille joined him, both of them sipping tea in silence. No titles. No shame. Just two people sharing the echo of a space built on intention. She told him a story, brief, simple, about the early days of the restaurant. About how she used to sleep in the back storage room between lunch and dinner service. About a night she cried over a sauce that wouldn't thicken. About the moment she decided she'd rather work with heart than chase perfection. Vincent didn't respond with stories of IPOs or market crashes. He listened. And that, she would later say, was the moment she forgave him, not for the cold plate, but for the years of forgetting that people weren't systems to fix. From that point on, their connection took on a quiet rhythm. He brought small things, herbs from his balcony garden, new books for the restaurant's shelf, fresh pastries from a morning market. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that demanded acknowledgement. And Camille, in turn, let him help. In small, essential ways. Together, without ever declaring it, they had rewritten the moment that had once defined them. He didn't need her forgiveness. And she didn't need his remorse. What they gave each other was more lasting, mutual understanding. Because in the end, an apology isn't something you say. It's something you become. It's strange how quietly transformation arrives. There's no fanfare, no announcement, no sudden swell of music in the background. It creeps in through repetition, through presence, through small choices made again and again. Vincent Silver didn't wake up one morning a different man. He simply kept showing up, until one day, without realizing it, he wasn't showing up for redemption anymore. He was showing up for her. For the space. For something that finally felt real. Months had passed. The seasons shifted. The air turned crisp, and golden leaves gathered on the sidewalk outside Camille's restaurant. The same place he once entered with arrogance had now become something else entirely. A shelter. A mirror. A reminder. He had stopped bringing his driver. Stopped wearing watches that cost more than the kitchen's monthly rent. He still lived in his penthouse, still managed his company, but his posture had softened. His voice had gentled. And something in his eyes, once tight and calculating, had begun to release. He had learned to wait. To listen. To serve in his own quiet way. On Thursdays, he helped unload the delivery truck. On Sundays, he brewed the first pot of coffee for the morning prep team. He knew the names of every staff member, remembered birthdays, learned how to fold napkins properly. Not because he was trying to belong, but because, without realizing it, he already did. The regulars noticed. They didn't know who he was, at least, not the version the world knew. To them, he was Vincent. The quiet man who sometimes served tea, sometimes swept the floor, and always arrived with something thoughtful in his hands. A fresh bouquet for the hostess desk. A handwritten quote taped to the staff bulletin board. A smile that no longer needed to prove anything. Camille had become a constant in his life. Not loud. Not romantic in the traditional sense. But steady. Their connection was built like the restaurant itself, carefully, brick by brick, with no rush to finish. They shared more silence than words. But in that silence lived the kind of trust most people spend their lives chasing. And then one evening, everything shifted again. It was a Friday. The restaurant was full. The laughter was loud. The kitchen buzzed. Camille was everywhere at once, balancing trays, calming a new hire, reviewing reservations, offering compliments. It was one of those nights where everything went wrong in just the right way, and still it worked. Vincent, as usual, was behind the bar, drying glasses, when he noticed something unusual. Camille was tired. Not physically, but emotionally. Her smile was present, but faded. Her steps, efficient but slower. She wasn't unraveling. She was simply stretched. After closing, while the others headed home, he found her sitting alone in the garden behind the restaurant. The same place where months ago, he had left her a book and a line that changed everything. This time, he brought nothing. Only himself. He sat beside her, silently. And in that moment, without permission or pretense, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. No words were exchanged. There was nothing to explain, no performance to give. The apology had long since passed. What remained was something neither of them had asked for, but both had quietly grown into: care, respect, recognition, a different kind of love. Not the kind that begins with fireworks, but the kind that's lit by candlelight, slow, warm, enduring. Later that week, Camille surprised him. She invited him to a dinner, not at the restaurant, but at her apartment. Simple food. Soft music. A few books scattered on the table. It was the first time he had entered someone's home without feeling like he needed to impress or prepare. They ate slowly. They laughed. He washed dishes. She dried. At one point, she asked him lightly, "Do you ever miss who you used to be?" He thought about it. And then, with a quiet certainty he didn't know he carried, he answered, "No." He was always hungry. And he never tasted anything. She smiled. And they kept eating. That night, as he walked home, jacket slung over his shoulder, hands in his pockets, he passed by the glowing windows of the restaurant and paused. He saw the chairs stacked, the lights dimmed, the familiar stillness of a place at rest. He realized then that he hadn't just fallen for Camille. He had fallen for the life she showed him was possible. A life that moved slower, that forgave more easily, that didn't demand perfection, but invited presence. A few months later, without ceremony, Vincent stepped down as CEO. He still consulted, still mentored, still invested. But the man who once chased legacy through headlines now found it in smaller things. A perfectly plated dish, a shared laugh with a dishwasher, a handwritten note left in a coat pocket. He had everything before. But now he had warmth. And as winter settled over the city, Vincent Silver, once the man with the coldest plate in the room, discovered that the warmest meals weren't the ones served on time. They were the ones that made you stay. Thank you for spending this moment with us. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see something differently, consider subscribing. We share stories like this to remind ourselves that change doesn't always come from big events. Sometimes, it begins with something as small as a plate of food and the courage to apologize. And now we want to hear from you. What part of this story touched you the most? Scroll down and tell us in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay kind, stay human.